Thank you for choosing American Pest CEUs.
Hi, I'm Sean Reeves with American Pest CEUs. I've been in the pest management industry since 1999. I'm an associate certified entomologist, and I'll be your instructor for today's course. Today's course was compiled by Jack Launius, who has served in the pest management industry since 1990.
Core Manual, Chapter 1, Part 2.
Quarantine. Quarantine is a pest control process designed to prevent entry of certain pests into pest-free areas. Some states maintain inspection stations at all major entry points to intercept pests or materials that might harbor pests. Regulatory agencies monitor airports and ocean ports. Quarantine also prevents movement of designated pests within a state. Identified items being shipped from a quarantine area must be treated to destroy pests before shipment. Nursery stock, plant cuttings, seed shipments, and budding and grafting material are also regulated to prevent the spread of pests. And when you think about this word quarantine, it makes sense. If you've ever been through a pandemic, like back in 2019, 2021, we went through around the world, you're going to look at people being quarantined if they were positive for things like COVID-19. We tend to deal with pests in the same way. Look at items being shipped from a quarantined area. It's very important that you treat and destroy the pests before shipment. So that's what these regulatory agencies are doing. They're making sure that these types of items are treated before it's shipped to the U.S. Because if we don't, we're going to get all these invasive species, and it's just a major problem to handle them once they get set up. You have to track how they got in, where they got in, and where they've spread to. It's much easier to use this process of quarantining. Eradication is the elimination of a pest from a designated area. Often these pests are under quarantine restrictions. When eradication is required, the geographical extent of pest infestation is determined and control measures are taken to eliminate this pest from the defined area. Procedures may include an area-wide spraying program, releasing sterile insects, and intensive monitoring for pests within and around the borders of an infested area. Specifically with eradication, I just want you to remember that it's looking at the geographical extent of pest infestation that's determined and control measures taken to eliminate the pest from the defined area. That's a big thing for you to remember. So obviously, if we're going to eradicate something, we need to look at what the area is. If we're trying to get German cockroaches out of a kitchen, then that's the area we need to eradicate the pest. I know I'm making that really simple, but the point is understanding that eradication is that. It's the removal and eradication, if you will, of a pest from a certain defined area. Government agencies are authorized to destroy weeds and plants that cause fire hazards, harbor harmful pathogens or animals, or are noxious to people or livestock in and around agricultural areas. Similar authority applies to disease or infected livestock or poultry and to weeds and nuisance plants in residential, commercial, and industrial areas. Mosquito abatement is an important pest control function undertaken to protect public health. Mosquito abatement laws allow state agencies to drain or treat standing water that provides breeding sites for mosquitoes. So I like the example they gave here when we talk about mosquito abatement. There's laws and even state agencies or other local agencies that help in mosquito abatement in local communities. For instance, where I live, we have a mosquito authority through the county, and they'll go out and they'll use larvicides and they'll use adulticides to control the local mosquito population. Without these larger scale control tactics, it's not feasible that you would ever get a decent control over a mosquito population. So that's why in certain cases governmental authorities have to jump in, because when you're dealing with a large geographic area, it's not something that a company can do, not a pest control company or any private company. So you do have these government entities step in. Why practice IPM? IPM helps to keep a balanced ecosystem. Pesticides can be ineffective. IPM can save money. IPM promotes a healthy environment. IPM maintains a good public image. I think it is important to talk about why you would practice IPM. We obviously want to keep a balanced ecosystem, so everything we do partially is protecting the environment. Pesticides can be ineffective. You're going to see more points about that, but pesticides are not always the answer. Now, of course, IPM can save you money, and most all of you in business understand that's very important. We also have to maintain a healthy environment, as we just said, and IPM maintains a good public image. So one of the things we work in the pest management industry is our image and how we look to consumers and even people that are not buying our services. So we really always need to maintain a good public image. Integrated Pest Management, IPM. Pesticide use is a significant factor in food and fiber production, forestry, turf, and landscape maintenance and public health. In recent years, pest management has shifted from relying heavily on pesticides to using an integrated approach based on pest assessment, decision-making, and evaluation. This pest management approach has benefited pest managers and the environment, decreased pesticide use, and reduced the occurrence of pesticide resistance in pest populations. Couple things you want to pick up from this slide is the fact that this approach based on pest assessment, decision making, and evaluation has shifted people from just using pesticides on everything. So it's really changed our industry a lot. We're not always a spray first industry now, and I think that's a really good thing for the reasons that are listed here. It's helping the environment, decrease pesticide use, and it's also reducing the occurrence of pesticide resistance and pest populations. So in our core training, we talk a lot about resistance. The reality is the more pesticides we use, the more resistance is built, the harder it can be to control these pest populations, like these superbugs, if you will, where, again, you kill 98% of the population, but 2% is resistant. Then they multiply, and those genes get passed on to the new population. Then you've got to switch your whole pesticide mix to ever solve the problem. Integrated pest management is a balanced, tactical approach to pest control. It defines ways to anticipate pest outbreaks and prevent pest damage. IPM is a pest management strategy that uses a wide range of pest control methods, e.g., cultural, biological, mechanical, and chemical, or tactics such as sanitation and exclusion. The goal of this strategy is to prevent pests from reaching damaging levels with the least risk to the environment. Such pest management programs enable the specialists to make intelligent, site-specific decisions about pest control. What we're saying here is when you use IPM, you're looking at a pest management strategy that uses a wide range of pest control methods. So it makes it a balanced, more tactical approach to pest control. When we incorporate these cultural, biological, mechanical, and chemical methods, or even the tactics of sanitation and exclusion, we're really doing pest control. I'm going to say this again. Any homeowner, any business owner can go to Home Depot, they can get a pesticide and hose down their home, their property, whatever. But they're not really doing pest control, and they're definitely not doing things with the least risk to the environment. So we just have to make sure that we're following these IPM strategies, because that's what truly makes us a professional. If you're not following IPM and you're just a spray first, hose everything down type of person or company, you're not really doing pest control. You're just saying, hey, I'm going to hose down your property until it's glowing green, and you shouldn't see any insects, and if you do, we'll come back, maybe, whatever. But the reality is that IPM is much more in depth, and when you follow these practices, you're going to have a much more successful pest control strategy. So let's think about this. Why would we practice IPM? IPM helps preserve a balanced ecosystem. Every ecosystem made up of living things and their non-living environment has a balance. The actions of one kind of organism usually affect other species. Introducing chemicals into the ecosystem can change this balance, destroying certain species and allowing other species, sometimes other pests, to dominate. Unfortunately, pesticides can kill beneficial insects that consume pests, leaving few natural pest control mechanisms. I hope everyone understands what we're saying here. Each of these ecosystems is delicate, and if you get it out of balance, you're going to have an issue. When you introduce a chemical, let's say a broad spectrum chemical that's just killing everything, you're going to have major problems because the idea is, well, we want to kill our target insects. The problem is you're also killing the beneficial species. So in reality, we want to target certain species of insects, but we don't want to target them all. Because when you kill all the predators, even the insects you're trying to control, they're going to move back into the area at some point. When you kill all the predators, there's going to be no natural enemies, so then they're going to be able to set up and repopulate really quickly. Pesticides can be ineffective. Chemical pesticides do not always work. As mentioned earlier, many common weeds, insects, and disease-causing fungi have developed a resistance to pesticides. Furthermore, pests may survive if the chemical does not reach them, is washed off, or is applied improperly. When we talk about pesticides being ineffective, that's something that I think surprises a lot of people. Once again, the spray first people just think if I spray a product, it takes care of everything. But let's think about a couple things mentioned here in the slide. As we've already mentioned, many common weeds, insects, and disease-causing fungi have developed a resistance to pesticides. So once again, that's always going to be an issue if you're putting pesticides out, especially over and over again without rotating them. They're just going to build more and more resistance. Furthermore, as it talks about here, pests may survive if the chemical does not reach them, is washed off, or is applied improperly. So there's a few different things here. Obviously, a lot of times in a big, large area, you're not going to get the product in the areas where the pests are, especially on outdoor applications. The product can be washed off, whether it's from rain outside, whether somebody in their own home might have a cleaning company come out when you do a crack and crevice treatment and they could wash it right off, or improper application, which is very common. A lot of people just are not going to mix pesticides properly. They're not going to apply them properly. They're going to put them in areas where they shouldn't. So obviously at that point, the pesticides are going to become ineffective. IPM can save money. A good IPM program can prevent crop loss and landscape or structural damage caused by pests. IPM may also avoid the cost of purchasing unnecessary pesticides. Moreover, IPM can reduce the cost of treating chronic conditions, such as asthma, by controlling disease triggers. Let's just say this, when we talk about IPM saving money, the reality is in any type of business, and any of you that have been in business or work for a company, understand that saving money is a big deal. So if we can use IPM, we can save money and use less pesticides, especially when it's unnecessary. It's a win for the environment, a win for the company, and really a win for you as the applicator. IPM promotes a healthy environment. Using IPM strategies helps reduce environmental injury. Using fewer pesticides lowers the risk that persistent chemicals may harm living creatures and contaminate groundwater. It also lessens the need to dispose of containers and unused pesticides. I like how we sum up here that IPM promotes a healthy environment. Obviously, our goals with IPM strategy is to reduce environmental injury, and using fewer pesticides is always going to lower the risk that persistent chemicals are going to harm living creatures, end up in our drinking water, end up in our food supply. I mean, there's a lot of different things that can happen when you use too many pesticides or you don't use them correctly. So I really like the idea of IPM, as I keep mentioning throughout our training, for the fact that it is protecting our environment, and not the least of which, it's protecting each of us from being exposed to and ingesting pesticides down the line. I like how we sum up here that IPM promotes a healthy environment. Obviously, our goals with IPM strategy is to reduce environmental injury, And using fewer pesticides is always going to lower the risk that persistent chemicals are going to harm living creatures, end up in our drinking water, end up in our food supply. I mean, there's a lot of different things that can happen when you use too many pesticides or you don't use them correctly. So I really like the idea of IPM, as I keep mentioning throughout our training, for the fact that it is protecting our environment, and not the least of which, it's protecting each of us from being exposed to and ingesting pesticides down the line. Components of IPM. The components of an IPM approach can be grouped into the following 5 steps. Step 1 is going to be identify the pest and understand its biology. The first step in any pest management program is to identify the pest, whether you're dealing with an insect, weed, plant disease, or vertebrate animal. Components of IPM. Once you have identified the pest, you can determine its significance and the need for control. Some pests have little impact on a plant, animal, or structure and do not require control. Others warrant immediate control because they cause serious damage or present a significant threat to human health or public safety. As we talk more about the components of IPM, key pests may cause major damage on a regular basis unless they are controlled. Many weeds, for example, are key pests because they compete with crop or ornamental plants for resources and require regular control efforts to prevent or reduce damage. Cockroaches and rodents are also examples of key pests because their waste and body coverings, shed cockroach skins, rodent hairs, can trigger asthma in some people. Secondary pests become a problem when a key pest is controlled or absent. For example, some weed species become pests only after key weeds, which are normally more successful in competing for resources, are controlled. Certain species of fleas, ticks, and blood-feeding bugs attack people only when their natural hosts, such as pet dogs or cats, are no longer present. What we're basically getting at on this slide is that it's very important that you control key pests that can cause the major damage. You just have to understand, sometimes when you control a key pest, secondary pests can arise because of what you did to control the key pest. You need to understand what the results of that action can be and understand that you don't want a secondary pest to become a problem because of controlling the key pest. Looking further into components of IPM, occasional pests become troublesome only once in a while because of their life cycles, environmental influences, or as a result of human activities. For instance, ants may become occasional pests when sanitation practices change, providing them with food that previously did not exist. They also may move into buildings after a rainfall or other event destroys an outdoor food source. There's a great point here for everybody to pick up when it comes to insects like ants. When it does rain a lot outside, that event can destroy their outdoor food source. So a lot of times ants feed on honeydew, which is aphid excrement on the plants and the ornamentals. When that gets washed away, there's no food source outside, so the ants move into the buildings. I know a lot of people think that ants just get flooded in from rain and things like that, but it's actually this washing away of the food source that's driving the ants into the structures. Looking at step 2 on the components of IPM, we're going to monitor the target pest. The key to a successful IPM program is regular monitoring. This involves measuring pest populations and/or the resultant damage or losses. Monitoring procedures vary with the pest and the situation. There's a very simple reason why we need to monitor the target pest when it comes to IPM. This lets us know how our IPM program is working. It's not just about the different steps we're taking with IPM, because we're going to do something different on every customer, let's say, but we need to monitor the target pest to see how it's working. If we don't monitor the target pest, we have no idea the success of our IPM program. When looking further at components of IPM, carefully looking at plants or animals over time, scouting, and trapping are often used to monitor insects and their activity. Weather and temperature data are particularly helpful in following a pest life cycle or in predicting how long it takes a certain pest to develop. Models exist for specific insects and plant diseases that predict the need for and timing of pesticide application. Once again here we're using our monitoring to figure out when and if we need to use pesticides. So obviously there's times when you're going to need to use them, but what insect are you looking at? What are we coming across in our glue traps, things like that? And then figuring out not just the need for the pesticide, but the timing based on the insect's life cycle. There may be different times when it's easier to attack that specific pest. Furthermore, with components of IPM, we need to talk about pest population thresholds. Agricultural or ornamental producers must understand the concept of economic thresholds. The presence of a pest does not always cause a loss in quality or quantity of a product. To justify the cost of control, pest populations must be large enough to cause significant damage. This is called the economic threshold, or ET. With the concept we're introducing here, just to kind of make it on a simple level, let's say we had 1,000 acres of a crop growing like corn, make it something simple, and it was going to cost $10,000 to treat it with a pesticide, but we looked at the pests that were there and thought they're only going to cause $5,000 in crop damage. It wouldn't make sense to spend $10,000 to save $5,000 on the back end. So that would be like an economic threshold where it wouldn't make sense, but obviously if the pest was going to cause $20,000 worth of damage and was only $10,000 to treat, then we would definitely want to do an application to treat this pest because you would be saving money. As we look further into the economic threshold, this is the pest population density, number of pests per unit area, at which control measures are needed to prevent the pest from reaching the economic injury level. The economic injury level, EIL, is the pest population density that causes losses equal to the cost of control measures. To justify using a control method, it is necessary to set the ET below the EIL. Otherwise, producers lose money. First, from the damage caused by the pest, and then by the cost of the control method. Setting the ET below the EIL triggers the appropriate control method before pests reach the EIL. So I already gave you in the last slide the quick summary of what this means, but just remember that economic injury level, EIL, you need to remember that it's the pest population density that causes losses equal to the cost of control measures. The bottom line on that is a lot of these questions are on exams, and you need to understand what that is, because if you don't, you're going to get that question wrong. For pest managers not directly involved in commodity production, the concept of an action threshold is more appropriate. An action threshold is the pest level at which some type of pest management action must be taken. This is a predetermined pest level that is deemed to be unacceptable. Often, the action threshold is expressed as the number of pests per unit area. Below this level, IPM practitioners do not use any control measures, though they should continue to monitor the situation and do sanitation inspections as needed. Once a pest is at or above the action threshold, you should implement appropriate IPM strategies. For an action threshold, I'm going to make this really simple. If you go into your kitchen and you see one German cockroach, that would be an action threshold of 1 for most people, because you see one German cockroach, everybody knows there's probably more and you're going to have a problem. So again, the action threshold is easy on that. One German cockroach means I got to take action. I got to do pest control to solve this problem before it gets out of control. Components of IPM. In some situations, the action threshold for a pest may be 0, i.e., no presence of the pest is tolerated. Examples include pests capable of transmitting a human pathogen, e.g. mosquitoes and the West Nile virus, or of creating a public health emergency, e.g. cockroaches or rodents. To make a control measure profitable, or at least break even, it is necessary to set the economic threshold below the economic injury level. Continuing with components of IPM, landscape action thresholds consider not only the economic value of the landscape, but also its ecological and aesthetic roles. A higher action threshold would be set for insect damage when no harm is done to the plant, e.g. leaf galls on a shade tree, compared to a wood borer that may destroy the tree, action threshold of 0. I really like the example here of talking about leaf galls on a shade tree, because at the end of the day, maybe it's not the best looking thing, but it's not hurting the tree as a whole. Whereas if we have a wood borer that's destroying the whole tree, we're going to have an action threshold of 0 on the wood borer, because we could lose the whole tree and have to spend the value of putting it back in. And as many of you know, depending on how old the tree is, you're not going to buy another tree of that age and size. It's going to take years for it to regrow and get to where it was. Again, looking at components of IPM, action thresholds may vary by pest, e.g., a stinging insect in a classroom versus a foraging ant, by site, e.g., a storeroom versus a school infirmary, and by season, e.g., pests present daily versus 2 weeks of a year. Establishing action thresholds for a new IPM program will require a practical approach. First, establish an arbitrary action threshold for the major pests you encounter, then revise the action levels up or down as you gain understanding of a specific pest management setting. Next, with components of IPM, we need to develop the pest management goal. The goal of IPM programs is to keep pest damage at economically or aesthetically acceptable levels. Prevention and suppression techniques are often combined in an effective IPM program. As discussed above, eradication is sometimes, though rarely, the goal. The strategy for a sound IPM program is to coordinate the use of multiple tactics into a single integrated system. The simple way to summarize this slide is we're saying all components of the IPM program need to work together to get us to that pest management goal. Whether it's suppression, eradication, whatever that goal is, we need to make sure that all components work together to get us to that end goal. Further, with components of IPM, pesticides are just one control method. Non-chemical methods may provide longer and more permanent pest control. Consider these first when developing a pest management strategy. Evaluate the costs, benefits, and liabilities of each tactic. I always find it interesting to talk about non-chemical controls in this industry because pest control, weed control, whatever it is in lawn care, it doesn't really matter. We've always been a spray-first industry. But you really need to consider these alternatives when you're looking at IPM. Look at ways to develop a good long-lasting pest management strategy, and don't always look at the spray-first mentality as being the best direction to go. Obviously, you also, as it says here, need to evaluate the costs, benefits, and liabilities for each tactic. So if a tactic it could be really successful but it's really costly, then obviously it's not going to work. The benefits can also not be outweighed by the liabilities, so we really need to look and see what's going to happen. Even if we put out a pesticide, what's the effect on the insect we're trying to target, but what's the effect on the ecosystem as a whole in the area? Next, in components of IPM, we're going to look at prevention. There are economically and environmentally sound ways to prevent loss or damage from pests. Such techniques include planting weed and disease-free seed and growing varieties of plants resistant to diseases or insects. Other choices are using cultural controls to prevent weedy plants from seeding and choosing planting and harvesting times that lessen pest problems. Sanitation methods often reduce pest buildup. Other preventive methods involve excluding pests from the target area or host and using practices that conserve natural enemies. Making sure that plants, poultry, or livestock receive adequate water and nutrients often reduces stress and susceptibility to diseases or pests. As time has gone on, we're seeing more and more of these prevention tactics being employed. Obviously, you can imagine things such as planting weed and disease-free seed is a great idea, and also growing varieties of plants resistant to diseases or insects. These are all great ideas. Also, looking at things like making sure poultry and livestock have adequate water and nutrients. Reducing that stress is definitely going to help them be less susceptible to diseases or pests. These are just great ways to prevent problems before they even happen. Furthermore, with components of IPM, pesticides are sometimes used for pest prevention. For instance, growers treat some crops and landscapes with pre-plant or pre-emergence herbicides because they know that the weed seeds are present. If plant pathogens have already infected susceptible plants, economic damage usually cannot be prevented. For this reason, fungicides are normally applied before infection occurs, whenever environmental conditions favor infection. Likewise, pesticides may be applied to structural lumber before construction to prevent it from wood-destroying insects and fungi. In this slide, again, we're talking further on pest prevention, so I love the idea of pre-plant or pre-emergent herbicides to stop weeds before they grow, because we already know they're germinated in the soil. And we look at things like pesticides being applied to structural lumber before construction, or even after a home is built, let's say in the building process. These are great because you can use things like boron-based products to help prevent wood-destroying insects and fungi once people move into the home. Suppression sometimes lowers pest populations so that natural enemies can maintain control. Suppression is the goal of most pesticide applications. Other techniques such as cultivation, mowing weeds, and releasing biological control agents are also used to suppress pest populations. What we're saying on this slide is, our whole goal is to get the pest populations at a tolerable level or to a point below the EIL, that economic injury level. Suppression is a common goal in pest control to keep us below that level. So you're going to hear the word suppression a lot as you go through core training. But again, that's to keep the pest either at a tolerable level or to a point below the EIL. Looking further at components of IPM, we need to look at eradication. Eradication efforts are effective in buildings or other small, confined spaces where, once the pest is eliminated, it can be excluded. For example, eliminating cockroaches, rats, and mice from commercial food establishments requires eradication. Over larger areas, however, eradication is very expensive and often has limited success. Regulatory eradication programs are usually directed at exotic or introduced pests posing an area-wide public health or economic threat. Looking at our example here, eliminating cockroaches, rats, and mice from commercial food establishments is expected. You need to eradicate these types of things because you're dealing with a food-sensitive area. When I was growing up, my uncle had 50,000 acres of cattle and we would work on the farms, and the reality was we had a lot of fire ant problems, but there was no way we could eradicate them all. We would just try to suppress them where they were a major problem, and that was something we always had to look at. How much money was it going to cost? What was the economic injury level? And what would be the best way to control them, whether it was suppression or eradication? Again, with components of IPM, we need to implement the Integrated Pest Management Program. Once you have selected appropriate methods and have set predetermined thresholds, you can initiate the IPM program. IPM programs are specific to each situation and can be adjusted as you learn more about the pest and the site. Observe all local, state, and federal regulations regarding the methods chosen. So it's very important to know when we get to this step where we're going to implement the Integrated Pest Management Program, you've already decided the appropriate methods and you have your predetermined thresholds. So you already know what threshold of pests somebody can stand in that area. As you initiate the IPM program, just make sure that they're specific to each situation and that you can adjust that program as you learn more about the pest on the site. So keep in mind, we're not just going to put in an IPM program. We're going to observe, we're going to look at our results, and we're going to change them up as we need to. And of course, always observe all local, state, and federal regulations regarding the methods chosen. This is pretty simple, but just keep in mind, when you work in different areas, there can be different laws. Federal regulations are always going to be there, but local and state can have different laws, so just make sure you keep your eyes out on those. Next, in components of IPM, we're going to record and evaluate results. It is extremely important to record and evaluate the results of each pest management effort. Some control methods, especially non-chemical ones, are slow to yield measurable results. Other methods may be ineffective or even damage the target crop, animal, treated surface, or natural enemy. Objectively evaluate how well your strategies work so that you will be better prepared if you must control a specific pest again. This is one of my personal favorite steps of IPM because I really like to record and evaluate what I do. Basically, I want to know if it's working. When I look at this, like when I play sports, or those of you that watch sports on TV, you can come in with a game plan, you can draw it up, but the reality is if it's not working, how effective is it? You're going to have to change, you're going to have to pivot. It's no different when you're working with IPM. You got to put some methods in place, you got to employ the techniques you think are going to work, then you got to record and evaluate results, and then you got to shift that game plan if it's not working to a different strategy that's going to work better. Let's talk about the effectiveness of pest management programs. As noted earlier, pesticides represent only one tool in the IPM toolbox. When combined with other control methods, they can help create an effective treatment plan to reduce pest populations. However, pesticides might not control the pest as expected. A good pest manager needs to find out why. So again, assuming you put some pest management methods in place and you realize as you've measured the results they're not working, you need to figure out why. So you almost have to be a good detective. You have to look at the site, look and see what your results are, and then look for clues as to why it didn't work. Because now you're going to have to figure out how to shift strategies to another one that's going to work in the future. That leads us to a good question that we all need to ask ourselves from time to time in the industry. Why pesticide applications fail? Pest identification, sometimes a pesticide application fails because the pest was not identified correctly. Being able to accurately identify pests requires patience and practice. For example, knowing the difference between a caterpillar and a sawfly will result in success, control, or failure when using Bacillus thuringiensis. BT is effective on caterpillars but not on sawflies. Even non-chemical tactics may fail if the pest and susceptible life stages are not accurately identified. When we look at misidentification of the pest, look at the image on the screen. This, in a lot of ways, looks like an ant mound coming up through a floor. This is a real hardwood floor, so in reality what we figured out when we swept it away was there's a kick-out hole of drywood termites coming through that floor. So this was actually drywood termites. But it would have been really easy to look at this and go, you know what that is? That's ants bringing soil up from the ground up through the floor, and they have a little mound under there. So keep in mind that misidentification's really easy if you're not well skilled and don't use the tools you have to identify things like this. Or in this case, is this an ant or a termite? Well, if we really look at it, you can see it's got a pinched waist and it's got elbowed antenna, so this is actually an ant. Interestingly enough, this is a big-headed ant, denoted by the big head, but it's something where a lot of people that weren't well-versed in the industry would look at it and go, that's definitely a termite. Look at those big mandibles coming out of the head. It has to be a termite, right? In reality, it is an ant. Let's play one more round of our ant or termite game. Look at the image on the screen. Do you think it's an ant or a termite? Believe it or not, in this case, it's a termite. As you can see, it's got a full waist. There's no pinch in the waist, so it's like one segment. Also, you can see on the antenna that it's straight. Now around this termite, because it had kicked its wings off, it was a swarmer, you would have noticed also there were wings in the area, which really aren't showing up in this photo. But my point is, a lot of people that don't know the difference could have easily thought this was an ant. I use these simple illustrations and the differences between ants and termites because these are commonly misidentified in our industry. So keep in mind, you need to know these subtle differences between things like ants and termites, because if you misidentify the pest, you're never going to solve the problem. Let's look deeper into why pesticide applications fail. Let's look at dosage. You need to make sure that you have applied the correct pesticide at the correct dosage according to label instructions. Or correct use. Some herbicides are formulated to kill grasses, others for broadleaf weeds, and still others can kill both types of weeds. Always read the pesticide label to see if the target pest is listed. So we need to make sure we use the correct dosage. As we talk about in these courses all the time, the label's the law. If you're not following the label, you're outside of the law. But there's a bigger thing to that too. The reality is that these products have been tested and formulated for a certain dosage to be effective. So we always have to make sure our dosage is correct. We have to make sure the product is being used for its intended use. So if you're using an herbicide like we talk about here that's made to kill grasses, or using one for broadleaf weeds, you're going to get two different outcomes. So you can definitely possibly use one for broadleaf weeds that doesn't kill the grass, but also if you're using one that just kills grass, it's not going to kill the broadleaf weeds. So make sure you understand the intended use of the pesticide or herbicide you're employing. Why pesticide applications fail. Application timing. Other applications fail because the pesticide was not applied at the correct time. The pest may not have been in the area during the application, or it may have been in a life cycle stage where it was not susceptible to the pesticide. Insects are usually more vulnerable when they are immature, and weeds are most easily controlled before they flower and go to seed. Also remember that current pests may be part of a new infestation that developed long after the chemical was applied. A lot of this goes back to identification of the insect or weed or whatever you're looking at. You need to understand treating it at the right time, but you have to understand what you're looking at first. So just keep in mind, certain weeds, certain insects are going to be more susceptible in different life stages. Actually, some things can't even be killed in certain stages because they're protected. So you always need to understand, you identify them, then look at the timing of the application to make sure you're hitting them at the right time. Continuing to look at why pesticide application fails, one thing we need to talk about is application equipment. Concealed pests under leaves or bark, in the soil, or within stems or fruits are difficult to reach. This means that knowing the best type of application equipment to use is very important. For example, use an air blast sprayer for pests hiding under apple tree leaves, but a granular applicator during planting operations for soil-dwelling agronomic pests. I think this is pretty easy to understand that obviously the type of application equipment you need is going to be very important. If you're doing a mosquito control application, you're going to need something with a finer droplet size than if you're doing a termite application and spraying termiticide into a trench. So just keep in mind that you need to make sure you have the correct application equipment for the products you're using. Another reason why pesticide applications can fail is environmental conditions. In general, do not apply pesticides just before a rainstorm. The pesticide may be washed off target plants and away from the application site. Temperature extremes and windy conditions can move pesticides away from the target pest and site. One thing you have to think about is, what is the weather forecast? So as many of you know, it could be a bright sunny day outside. Where I live in Florida, it's very common for it to be bright and sunny at
10, 11, 12 in the morning, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, even up to 3 o'clock. But especially in the summertime in the afternoon, we can start getting heavy rains by 4, 5, 6 o'clock. So you have to think to yourself, if I put a pesticide out at 2:30, and especially if I'm seeing storm clouds in the distance, is this going to be an issue? Is there going to be a storm? Is there going to be heavy rain that's going to cause runoff? We need to look at the forecast. The forecast is priceless. How many places now can you get a nice 10-day forecast, even hourly forecast? You can really look day to day and see what the forecast is and make sure you're not putting pesticides out at a time when you know rain is going to be imminent in the area. Looking a little further into why pesticide applications fail, we need to look at pesticide degradation. Pesticides may degrade when stored. Under some conditions, pesticides can change into a form that is ineffective. This might be due to the age of the product or the pesticide storage conditions. For example, granular pesticides stored in wet or very humid conditions will draw moisture. This may cause clumping or possible deactivation of the pesticide. A lot of these things probably seem like a no-brainer to those of you that have been working with pesticides for a while. You have to think to yourself, if you put pesticides in an area where they're going to get wet or that's high in humidity, the products are going to absorb that moisture if they're a certain type, like granular baits, things like that, and they're going to become ineffective. The same way if you put a bag of granules out in an area, say in the back of your truck, and it gets rained on, of course eventually that rain's going to affect the granules. So we need to think about the wet or very humid conditions and the moisture, and understand once we let the pesticides be tainted by this, they're going to be ineffective, and we're really going to be wasting time and money by even trying to use them. More on why pesticide applications fail. Another thing to look at is pesticide resistance. Pesticide resistance is the ability of a pest to tolerate a pesticide that once controlled it. Resistance develops when intensive pesticide use kills the susceptible individuals in a population, but leaves the resistant ones to reproduce. Initially, higher labeled rates and more frequent applications are needed to control resistant pests. Eventually, the pesticide will have little to no effect on the pest populations as the resistant population grows. This is a real problem in our industry because a lot of companies just think, I buy a pesticide, this pesticide really works for me, it's really effective on the insects I'm trying to kill, so they use the same products over and over and over again. What we're talking about here with resistance is the fact that you might go out and you might kill 95, 98% of a pest population. The issue is, let's say 5% of that population is immune to the product. That percentage of the population continues to reproduce, and they breed what I call like hybrid insects. And what happens is that they end up being ones that pass on those genes to the next generations, so that in essence, eventually, the product's not working at all because of pesticide resistance. This is why you'll see pest and lawn care companies rotate their products. So if you're working for a pest control company, maybe every quarter you switch up your products because you know we don't need to use those same products over and over and over again. So if we switch them up quarterly, switch up the active ingredients, the modes of action, we know the chances of resistance are a whole lot less. And the same idea with weed control in lawns. Again, anyone with experience is going to rotate those products, and especially when it comes to different times of the year, you're going to need different active ingredient and different modes of action anyways. But again, when you're doing that, you're also working against this issue of resistance that we don't want to have happen. Again, looking further into pesticide resistance, when looking at why pesticide applications fail, it's important to know that resistance may develop to a single insecticide, fungicide, herbicide, or rodenticide. More often, however, pest populations become resistant to chemically related pesticides in a class of compounds. It is also possible for a pest to develop resistance to pesticides in two or more classes of compounds with different modes of action. One thing this slide is introducing to you is the fact that resistance may develop to a single insecticide, fungicide, herbicide, or rodenticide. So you just need to rotate those products. It's not that you don't target those pests or those weeds or whatever again. You may just need to mix up the product or rotate the product. You also have to understand that it can be common for a pest to develop resistance to pesticides in 2 or more classes of compounds with different modes of action. So just because you rotate a product once and then you start using another one doesn't mean they can't build resistance to that product or that mode of action. So keep in mind, this product rotation has to go over and over again. Look at our pest control customers. If they've been with us 5, 10, 15, 20 years, how many different types of products have we had to use on their homes to get the same results we're looking for? Those are the things you need to think about. Further, in the pesticide resistance part of why pesticide applications fail, we need to know the fact that continual use of pesticides from the same chemical class, such as all growth regulator herbicides or all pyrethroids insecticides, increases the likelihood that resistance will develop in a pest population. Frequent applications and greater persistence of the chemical further increase the chances of pesticide resistance. Finally, resistance can spread through a pest population much more rapidly in pests that have many generations per year and many offspring per generation, such as many insects, mites, fungi, and rodents. I feel like we're going over the same theme here, but just to break this down, again, you're using continual pesticides from the same chemical class, such as all growth regulator herbicides or all pyrethroid insecticides. You're obviously increasing the likelihood that resistance will develop in a pest population. As you understand that, then you have to think about the fact that frequent applications and greater persistence of the chemical further increase the chances of pesticide resistance. This goes back to why we don't continually go out and spray products on somebody's property over and over again. People call up 5 days after the application and tell you, oh, it didn't work, I still got a problem. You don't want to continue to go out, keep putting down the same products, and then build this resistance that's going to cause you a major problem in the future. Also, the quicker a pest population reproduces and the more offspring they have per generation, the quicker they can build the resistance. And as we talked about here, many insects, mites, fungi, and rodents do reproduce very quickly, so the chances of resistance to build up are a lot quicker and things like that. More on pesticide resistance, we need to know that several pest management tactics help prevent or delay the occurrence of pesticide resistance. One approach is the use of new or altered pesticides. Using new compounds with different modes of action will lessen the likelihood of resistance developing in a population. Most pesticides have a code number at the top of the label indicating the mode of action, e.g. Group 4A insecticides, neonicotinoids, or Group 2 herbicides, ALS inhibitors. Let's think about what we're saying here. We're talking about new technology. We're talking about new or altered pesticides. So the idea is these new compounds, they're going to have different modes of actions. They're going to have different active ingredients. That's something that the pests have never been subjected to. So this is really easy when you think about resistance. The fact if you're using these new types of pesticides, they really shouldn't have the same resistance to them. I'm not telling you it couldn't happen, but the idea is you look at the new technology in pesticides, you look at their modes of action, and you decide what's going to work for you to mix some of these up into your product rotation, specifically to get around this pesticide resistance issue. More on pesticide resistance. Unfortunately, new replacement products are often quite complex, difficult to synthesize, and very costly to develop. Moreover, they have very specific modes of action, which can rapidly lead to the development of resistant pest populations even after limited use is in the field. No longer can we expect to respond to pesticide resistance by merely substituting one pesticide for another. So I feel like we're speaking out of both sides of our mouth here. We're telling you to rotate your products, make sure that you do things to stop this resistance from building up, but also you have to understand that Just rotating products or switching from one product to another isn't necessarily going to stop pesticide resistance. So obviously continue to rotate your products, but keep an eye on this pesticide resistance issue. That's why we talk so much about integrated pest management. You need to measure your results and you need to find out if something's not working, why it's not working, and obviously rotating your products could be one of the things you can do, but also looking at things like the habitat and what changes can we make to slow the pest down, because sticking with the concept that more is better, just spray more products, is not really helping you solve your problems. It may work sometimes, but eventually it's going to catch up to you. As we look more into why pesticide applications fail, you need to know that changing pesticide use patterns is an important step in preventing resistance. When dosages are reduced, fewer pests are killed, so the pressure to develop resistant pest populations is decreased. Applying pesticides over limited areas reduces the proportion of the total pest population exposed to the chemical. The result is a large pool of individuals still susceptible to the pesticide. This tactic tends to delay the development of a resistant population because pesticide-susceptible individuals continue to interbreed with resistant ones, thus diluting the resistance in the population. Also, treating alternate generations of pests with pesticides that have different modes of action decreases the selection pressure for resistance. Of course, we've talked about this earlier, changing pesticide use patterns and mixing them up some, but also when dosages are reduced, fewer pests are killed, so the pressure to develop resistant pest populations is decreased. So keep in mind too, you need to look at your dosages. Now, when we talk about dosages, always follow the label. No matter what you do, the label is the law and you have to follow the label. But keep your eye on dosages and look at the different rates you can use a product to understand if it's going to make more sense to use it at a different dosage rate based on the pest you're trying to kill. Looking at our final slide on why pesticide applications fail, we need to know that managing pesticide resistance is a critical aspect of integrated pest management. Monitor pest populations carefully and treat only when necessary instead of on a schedule. Good pesticide application records are another important part of resistance management. Pesticides are more effectively managed when treatment history is known. Resistance must be detected when it is at a very low level. It should then be controlled by using all available pest management techniques to extend the useful life of our current pesticides. We keep going over some of these same topics for a reason. You need to make sure you monitor pest populations carefully and treat only when necessary. This is one way to make sure pesticide resistance doesn't become a problem. The other thing is look and see if you can figure out when resistance is detected at a very low level. It's going to help you understand when you need to rotate the products or when it's not working. So just make sure as part of your regular pest management program on any of your accounts, you're watching these types of things so that the resistance doesn't build up and become a major issue before you figure it out. In summary, successful pest management program begins with proper identification of the pest. Choosing the appropriate pest control method depends on recognizing and understanding the pest, its life cycle, habits, and habitat. Integrated pest management programs attempt to balance the need for pest control with the desire to protect the environment from pesticide contamination. Monitoring is critical to knowing where pests are located, when to act against growing pest populations, and what type of control measures to use. Evaluation and recording results help to determine how well the IPM program is working and whether there are any harmful human or environmental effects. Minimizing pesticide resistance is critical for sustaining the effectiveness of pest management programs. Using a variety of tools and techniques will help prevent or delay the occurrence of pesticide resistance. If the pest has not been properly identified, even non-chemical control tactics will fail. It is your responsibility to consider the effects of pest control actions on the entire treatment site, whether an outdoor area or inside a structure. Use good judgment, especially when pesticides are part of the control strategy, to avoid harmful effects to other living organisms and the environment. Congratulations, you have completed Chapter 1 of the Core Manual Study Guide. Please proceed to the exam questions.